Relay connection established. Origin unknown. Verification impossible. Archive access granted. Proceeding with recovered transmission. Designation. Ninth relay.
My name is Xavier Torres. For nearly a decade, I covered economics for one of the largest investigative news organizations in the country. Most people think financial journalism is about numbers, but it isn't. It's about people. Markets rise because people panic. Markets crash because people believe. Budgets, deficits, debt ceilings, they're all stories about fear, written in the language of mathematics. I spent years reporting on treasury auctions, inflation, government spending, and the endless political battles surrounding the national debt. Every few months, politicians stood before cameras, warning that the country was approaching the borrowing limit. Every few months, Congress argued until the final hours before reaching another agreement. It happened so often that most Americans stopped paying attention. Eventually, I did too. Then I found a sentence that shouldn't have existed. It appeared near the bottom of an appropriations report that had never been intended for public release. The document itself contained nothing unusual. Emergency expenditures, budget authorizations, agency funding requests. Buried within nearly 800 pages was a line that made absolutely no financial sense. Agreement successfully renewed. Maintain the ledger. Do not determine the consideration. There was no agency listed beside it, no budget code, no appendix, just those 3 sentences sitting alone between paragraphs, discussing disaster relief funding and Treasury bond projections. At first, I assumed it was a drafting error. Government reports pass through dozens of revisions before publication. Someone had probably forgotten to delete an internal note. Then I found the same sentence in another report. And another. The wording never changed. The dates did. The oldest copy I located came from 1954. The newest had been released only weeks earlier. Whatever the ledger was, someone had been quietly maintaining it for at least 70 years. My editor laughed when I showed him. He told me it was government paperwork, and that bureaucrats had been copy-pasting the same documents since the days of typewriters. He assigned me another story. I ignored him. Instead, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request asking for every document referencing the ledger. The request was denied under authorities normally reserved for intelligence operations. I changed the wording and filed another request. Denied again. I filed a third. This time, no one responded at all. The silence interested me far more than the denials. The first person willing to speak with me was Arthur Bell, a retired Treasury employee who had spent 42 years in federal service. We met in a small diner outside Baltimore. Arthur looked like a man who hadn't slept well in decades. When I asked him about the ledger, he stared into his coffee for nearly a full minute before speaking. He told me people believed the Treasury managed money, but money was only the visible part. I asked what he meant. He said there were 2 sets of books. The computers tracked the currency. The ledger tracked something else. When I asked what it tracked, he rubbed his hands together as though trying to warm them, and quietly admitted, "I don't know." I reminded him that he had worked there for 42 years. He simply nodded. I asked if he had never questioned it. He looked toward the restaurant window, where nothing stood except an empty parking lot before saying, "I asked once, I don't ask anymore." Before leaving, Arthur slid a folded napkin across the table. A single address had been written on it. No explanation. No name. Just an old government building in Washington. Officially, the building belonged to the Treasury Department's archival division. From the outside, it looked like every other federal office in the city. Gray stone, narrow windows, security cameras. Nothing remarkable. Inside, everything changed. Visitors surrendered their phones at the first checkpoint, laptops at the second, and every electronic device at the third. Beyond the final sealed door, The building no longer resembled a modern archive. Shelf after shelf stretched into darkness. Every shelf held handwritten ledgers. There were no computers, no printers, no scanners, only ink. An elderly woman sat alone at a wooden desk near the entrance. She greeted me without surprise and calmly said I had come about the ledger. I told her I had come to understand it. She smiled gently and corrected me. "No," she said. "You came because it called your attention." I asked what the ledger recorded. She answered, "I don't know." When I pointed out that she worked there, she replied, "I maintain it." I asked what she was writing. Without looking up, she dipped her pen into black ink and said, "The same numbers they've always written." I asked who they were. "The people before me." "Who taught them?" "The people before them." Finally, I asked how long the archive had existed. She paused before quietly answering, "Longer than this country, longer than every country." The oldest volume she showed me was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't paper. It wasn't parchment. I couldn't identify the material at all. The pages felt impossibly old, yet showed almost no decay. Symbols covered every line in a script that belonged to no civilization I recognized. The next volume was Egyptian, then Greek, then Latin, then medieval English, then modern English. Every civilization translated the ledger into its own language. None of them changed the numbers. Over the following months, I spoke with historians, economists, physicists, mathematicians, intelligence analysts, and retired government officials. Each had encountered fragments of the same mystery. None of them agreed on what the ledger measured. A physicist believed it tracked entropy and claimed every renewal increased the disorder of the universe. An economist believed it measured unrealized possibility, arguing that every extension erased futures that never had the chance to exist. A historian believed history itself was being consumed and wondered if ancient records hadn't been destroyed but had simply never existed in the first place. A mathematician filled an entire whiteboard with equations before erasing every one of them. When I asked what he had discovered, he stared at the empty board and whispered, "It's not probability. I don't think mathematics has a symbol for it." Every theory was different. Every conclusion was different. Yet every conversation ended with the same unanswered question: what are we paying? Months later, someone inside the Treasury finally agreed to meet me. The meeting took place in an empty conference room with no windows. He never told me his name. He had served through 4 presidential administrations. His first words were simple. Every incoming Treasury Secretary receives the same briefing. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. 3 sentences. Maintain the ledger. Renew the agreement. Never determine the consideration. I asked if that was really all there was. He nodded. I asked what happened if someone refused. He answered with one word: history. I frowned and asked what he meant. He leaned forward and quietly explained that every civilization that stopped maintaining the ledger disappeared. I told him there was no way to prove such a claim. He agreed, then said something I have never forgotten. Every civilization that inherited it found the records left behind by the last one. Eventually, I was granted access to a lower archive that officially didn't exist. The room wasn't listed on any blueprint. It sat beneath the building behind a vault door, requiring 3 separate keys. Inside rested a single stone table. Upon it lay one ancient parchment. Most of the writing had faded beyond recognition. Only one sentence remained legible: do not determine the consideration. Beneath it, written centuries later in different ink, another hand had added a warning: those who understand the price become part of the exchange. At first, I dismissed it as superstition, until I began investigating everyone who had searched for the answer before me. One researcher burned every notebook he had ever written, before vanishing from public life. Another resigned from government service and was found weeks later standing waist-deep in the Atlantic Ocean, staring silently toward the horizon. A mathematician abandoned his career and spent the remainder of his life drawing spirals instead of equations. Another investigator simply ceased to exist inside every federal database. Friends remembered him. Family remembered him. The government did not. Every investigation ended exactly the same way. Nobody ever published their conclusions. Near the end of my own investigation, I was escorted into a room that appeared nowhere on the building's architectural plans. It contained only a chair, a table, and a single folder. Across its cover, stamped in faded black ink, was one word: consideration. The official placed it before me and quietly said, "I can't advise you to open it." I asked if he had read it. He said no. I asked if he knew what was inside. He answered, "I know enough not to." Then he left. I sat alone for nearly an hour before finally opening the folder. I wish I could tell you what I found. I can't. Not because I refuse, but because there are no words capable of carrying what I understood in that moment. It wasn't language. It wasn't mathematics. It wasn't even information as we understand the word. For one impossible instant, I understood exactly what the ledger measured. I also understood why no civilization had ever written the answer down. I closed the folder, returned it to the table, walked out of the room, and never asked another question. 2 days later, Congress reached another agreement. Markets rallied. Television anchors celebrated another successful compromise. Economists debated interest rates. Politicians congratulated themselves. The country moved on. I tried to do the same. I packed every notebook into a box, every interview, every photograph, every copied document. I sealed the box and shoved it into the back of my closet. The first number appeared 3 days later. 563. It was printed on my grocery receipt. I barely noticed it. The following morning, my coffee order was number 562. That afternoon, my parking space was 562. The last 3 digits on the license plate in front of me were 562. The next morning, it became 561, then 560, then 559. Every day, one lower. At first, I blamed stress, confirmation bias. The human brain loves patterns, so I tested it. I paid cash. Receipt number 548. I changed flights. Gate 548. I rented another car. 548 miles. I flew across the country. Hotel room 548. The number never followed me. The world rearranged itself around it. I stopped watching television. I avoided receipts. I covered clocks. None of it mattered. Every morning, the number was one less. Sometimes I asked people if they noticed. "Did you see that number?" They looked at me with confusion. "What number?" I pointed toward a billboard. "The one right there." They stared at it for several seconds before looking back at me. "There isn't a number." Eventually, I stopped asking whether the number was following me. I started asking whether reality itself was changing to display it. Weeks became months. The countdown never stopped. Then one evening, every news channel interrupted programming. Congress had reached another agreement. The borrowing limit had been extended. Markets surged. Analysts smiled. Reporters declared the crisis over. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The next morning, I opened my eyes and looked at the alarm clock. 563. I stared at it for a very long time. The countdown hadn't ended. It had started over. That was when I finally understood. The number was never counting down to my death. It wasn't counting down to another recession. It wasn't counting down for the government. It was counting down until the agreement had to be renewed. The debt ceiling had never been about money. It had always been about time. Not time we borrowed. Time we had left before something older than civilization expected the ledger to be balanced once again. People still ask me what I discovered beneath the treasury. I always give them the same answer: nothing I can explain. Because the truth isn't hidden inside the ledger. The truth is hidden in a number that only I can see. And when I woke up this morning, it was one less than yesterday.
Transmission complete. Archive updated. Relay connection terminated. Signal lost.